Ukraine's homemade Flamingo missiles have hit a major Russian missile base that's used to launch Oreshnik missiles. And a top Russian general is fighting for his life after a targeted shooting in Moscow. Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. It's been a good week for Ukraine. Not often we can say that. We've seen spectacular footage of their strikes, including a fireball, enormous fireball, erupting over a fuel train in Tambov, some 250 miles inside Russian territory. No claims of responsibility as yet, but let's start with the FP5. Flamingo missile strikes against Russia's Kapustinin Yar missile base. This is not the first time that site has been hit, but it is significant. There are 5 main reasons I'm going to talk about today. The Flamingo is Ukraine's homegrown, homemade, long-range cruise missile. It has a range of about 3,000 kilometers. It can carry an explosive payload of 1,150 kilograms. That's more than a ton of bomb on the end of this missile. Not only is it incredibly powerful, it puts most of Russia's military industrial sites within range. And because Ukraine can produce it itself, it gives it that element of sovereignty. It's a symbol, this missile, of Ukraine's resilience, its resistance, its defiance, and of course its ingenuity, that the necessity of war forcing invention, Ukraine responding to the pressures it's under by developing a weapon with which it can strike back. Reason number 2, Capustinin Yar was the birthplace of the Soviet space program. After World War II, this missile test base was built, and it's where Soviet scientists were experimenting with Nazi V-2 rockets, Nazi rocketry at the very cutting edge of science by the end of World War II, and the USSR was really playing catch-up. So this is a prestigious site, but it's not just a prestige site. Reason number 3, this is where Russia has tested, developed and launched the Oreshnik intermediate range ballistic missile. Now don't be fooled by that word intermediate. The Oreshnik is a nuclear-capable hypersonic missile that blasts to the edge of space and then hurtles down on its targets at many tens, I think 13,000 miles per hour with multiple warheads. We've seen it used twice in Ukraine, once in Dnipro and once on the 7th of January, more recently in Lviv. It is one of Russia's most formidable conventional weapons. Formidable because it is so fast and it can carry such a significant payload that there's not much warning between launch and impact, and very little Ukraine can do to intercept it. And that's the same reason that Europe is concerned about it, because that missile, the Oreshnik, has the capability to hit targets across Europe, and Europe would have very little warning or chance to intercept it. Reason number 4, this was a complex operation. It wasn't just a strike or a series of strikes by the Flamingos. It was augmented by drone strikes and special operations attacks, probably designed to degrade Kapustinin Yar's air and missile defences to sort of clear the way for those Flamingo cruise missiles. And finally, reason number 5, there is footage and satellite imagery really emerging today and last couple of days showing the scale of the damage. This has been a significant strike, enormous craters obliterating buildings on that site. Ukraine's general staff have said they targeted areas where pre-launch preparations take place for these missile launches, and they said that the staff on the site have been evacuated. So it's hard to know in the long term what the impacts of these attacks will be. It is a demonstration of Ukraine's intent and capability, and at the very least, it has complicated the process for Russia launching and testing missiles like the Oreshnik. In other news today, a Russian general, Lieutenant General Vladimir Alexeyev, who's the deputy head of the GRU military intelligence unit, is today fighting for his life in a Moscow hospital after he was shot several times in the back on leaving an apartment building in the northwest of the city. There hasn't, at the time we're filming, been a claim of responsibility, but Ukrainian sources pointing out that General Alexeyev was involved in selecting targeting and gleaning the intelligence for missile and bomb strikes against Ukraine. He's been the deputy head of the GRU since 2011. So he would have been in post, the second in command of this military intelligence unit, when its officers carried out the 2018 nerve agent attack on British soil that left an innocent mum, Dawn Sturgis, dead. That was the GRU's attempt to assassinate a former Russian spy, Sergei Skripal, in Salisbury by spraying Novichok on his door handle. They didn't kill Skripal. They threw away the perfume bottle that they used to transport that Novichok, and it eventually killed Dawn Sturgis. In more bad news for Russia this week, Elon Musk appears to have switched off Starlinks, those satellite internet terminals, for Russian troops on the front line. This followed alarming footage, which we've talked about on Frontline before, showing Shahed drones and similar drones with Starlink terminals mounted on their backs. And what that allowed those drones to do was communicate via satellite internet as they were guided onto targets in Ukraine. There are American sanctions prohibiting sales of communications equipment to the Russian military. Now, we talked last week about how American equipment is ending up in the hands of the Russian military, but that's Ubiquity we were talking about, and that is through third parties. Ubiquity denies selling anything directly to the Russians, but they've been selling to other countries, other customers, and through a chain of smuggling and sanctions evasion, that kit has arrived in Russian hands. The difference with Starlink is that each terminal speaks directly to a satellite, and therefore the system, the Starlink system, the satellites can identify where the terminal is that they're talking to and who potentially it belongs to. And so they've introduced various restrictions, including cutting off Starlinks that are traveling too fast, which indicates that they are on aircraft, and more recently, according to the Ukrainians, shutting off Russian Starlinks along the front line. That has, again, complicated Russia's battlefield communications. It hasn't shut it down completely, but it's just another hurdle making life more difficult for Russian forces on the front. What's also making life difficult for Russian forces on the front? Well, Mikhailo Fedorov, Ukraine's newly appointed Minister of Defense, said 35,000 Russian soldiers were, in his words, eliminated during January, and he said that he has given the armed forces the target of increasing that to 50,000. Those are mind-boggling numbers. But the Ukrainian strategy is trying to inflict so much losses, such heavy losses on Russia, that prosecuting this war becomes unfathomable, impossible to continue. I should caveat that with the rather bleak assessments of Western officials that despite these losses, despite the human loss, we talked about this last time, despite the financial costs at the moment, Russia does appear to be able to continue to prosecute the war for the next 18 months, 2 years, based on its current trajectory. And Russia has continued its campaign of deep strikes. Over the course of the last week, we've seen at least 1,300 missiles and drones thrown at Ukraine. The most significant attack came on Monday, the 3rd of February, because that was 521 missiles and drones. But among those weapons were 71 missiles. And it's the missiles, these big ballistic Iskanders, Zircon hypersonic weapons, which are harder to intercept and carry a greater payload. So often it's the drones are used to overwhelm or reveal air defenses. It's these missiles which are used to hit the highest value targets. And top of Russia's list at the moment, as we know, are Ukraine's thermal heating and energy plants. It's the war to try and break the will, Russia's attempt to break the will of Ukraine's civilian population by freezing them to death. As temperatures have plunged to minus 20 degrees centigrade, Russia has hit the hot water and the heating supplies. And the mayor of Kyiv, Vitaly Klitschko, has warned it could take up to 2 months to repair the damage to the Darnitsia heat and power plant. That strike came as a so-called hiatus a suggestion from Moscow that there would be a pause on strikes on energy infrastructure came to an end. I've spoken to security officials here about those claims, and they were very dismissive. They pointed out that there is normally a gap of about 7 to 10 days between the biggest missile strikes, simply because it takes Russia that long to produce and rearm and get ready for the next strike. So whilst the drones, the steady drumbeat of Shahed drone attacks continues most nights with a couple of missiles, those big attacks are more infrequent. Along the front lines, in the close battle, Russia is continuing to grind forward slowly. They're also continuing their tactic of trying to choke Ukrainian supply lines. Now, some analysts suggesting that this is linked to the weather and the difficulties of infantry fighting in these freezing conditions, but more likely it's because they've seen these techniques work. It's a technique we saw developed in Kursk when Russia attacked the Ukrainian supply lines into Kursk. So they hit the road in Sumy that supplied Ukrainian troops in Kursk. We're seeing it in Konstantinivka, according to the Institute for the Study of War, reporting a flurry of strikes between 25 and 100 kilometers behind the front lines, also in Pokrovsk and also in Zaporizhia. Roads, railways, bridges being hit. A very alarming statistic that I read in one of the Institute for Study of War's daily updates is that Russia's drone forces now number 87,000 forces. That is larger than the entire British Army, which has shrunk to its smallest size for hundreds of years, just 70,000 fully trained troops. Talk quickly about the money. The European Union, the European Council rather, has formally agreed this 90 billion euro loan to Ukraine. That was announced in December, so we're seeing technical steps to get the money agreed. That is good news. That will fund Ukraine through this year and partway into 2027. But of course, it was Plan B. They agreed that loan only because Belgium refused to release the billions, hundreds of billions of frozen Russian assets in the Euroclear accounts. And another analysis I was pointed to this week that Europe is currently spending around 0.1% of its GDP to support Ukraine, and an argument that really what Europe needs to do is increase that almost tenfold to at least sort of 0.9% of GDP. The argument is the cost of losing to Russia, the cost of letting Russia conquer Ukraine or install a Moscow-friendly puppet government in Ukraine would be far, far higher to Europe because of what Europe would then have to do in the long run in terms of rearmament, in terms of deterrence. So the cost of losing in the long run is far higher than the cost of victory, but victory requires Europe to invest now, and that's a difficult political decision. A decision here in Britain we are seeing our government struggle with as they are unable to reveal how they're going to meet the needs of the domestic armed forces, how they're going to spend the money to effectively rearm. That is being delayed and delayed and delayed. Indicative, I think, of the challenges facing economies and governments across Europe. Finally, we're going to talk about the peace talks. They've been grinding on, inching on in Abu Dhabi, meetings between Americans, Ukrainians and Russians. Donald Trump has said, we're close, we've almost done it. But of course, it's the last steps that are always the hardest. We've heard from Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, saying that Russia and America agree on some things, but he sort of cautioned not to expect leaks, not to expect daily updates on how those talks are progressing. Interestingly, we also heard from the US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent saying he still believes Vladimir Putin is a war criminal, but he talked about the need and the importance to engage with Russia. And in parallel, we've heard that the US military is sort of reopening top-level talks with the Russian military. Now, that's almost certainly around nuclear proliferation and the lapsing of the New START treaties last week. And of course, having those channels open to avoid misunderstandings, miscalculations, basically so two people can pick up a phone and say, no, wait, we haven't launched a nuclear weapon, don't retaliate. That's really important. And yet for all of that, encouragement, small glimmers, very small glimmers of hope. We've also heard from Kirill Dmitriev, Vladimir Putin's foreign policy advisor, trolling, I should say, the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, telling him to resign and atone. He says, give Western civilization a chance. Just a sort of childish jibe, but perhaps indicative really of where Russian sentiment lies. If you have any questions, please ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time. Either I'll get into the comments or I'll answer them on the show. 4 questions I'm going to try and get through today. Question number 1, does it take longer to train a pilot or build a plane? It's a really good question. It's quite hard to answer because there are so many variables, but latest information from the UK is it takes almost 5 years to train a fast jet pilot. Now, how long it takes to produce a jet, of course, varies enormously. When we talked about Ukraine's long-range strikes against 15 aircraft last week, there was suggestion that was sort of a third of Russia's aircraft production. So, Russia can produce many aircraft a year, but it depends where you start the process of building a jet. Do you go back to the drawing board? Do you go back to the procurement process? Or are we talking about jets in production in an existing factory? If you compare it to that, it takes longer to train a pilot. Question number 2, why don't Ukraine's allies organise men in sheds, was the phrase, to make drones, to augment their drone production? It's an interesting question. Ukraine does not lack for the kind of men in sheds with 3D printers, coming up with new drones, coming up with novel ideas to work around Russia's defences and electronic warfare. Ukraine is ahead of the curve on ingenuity and evolution. What Ukraine struggles with is then scaling that up, so taking these great ideas and producing them at scale. Russia, much slower to come up with the new inventions, but much quicker at scaling them up. So actually what you've seen the focus on more recently is taking Ukrainian ingenuity to allied countries in Europe to try and scale that production. And that's why the UK, for example, has signed an agreement to co-produce or to manufacture in Britain Ukrainian Octopus drones, which are a blend of UK and Ukrainian technology. Question number 3, if Russian forces reach the fortress defensive lines of Konstantinivka, along the eastern Donbass, will they slow down? It's a good question. Russian forces are advancing so slowly, it's kind of hard to imagine them going even slower, but it's possible. And certainly they're going to find not just those fortress lines very, very difficult to breach, but also the cities that they will have to fight through in eastern Donbass are significantly bigger than Pokrovsk, significantly bigger than Bakhmut and Chasiv Yar. So you saw how long it took. It took a year to take Pokrovsk. It took even longer to take Bakhmut. So their advance is not going to come quickly in the Donbass. Where it is perhaps more concerning at the moment is in Zaporizhia, because Ukrainian defences are slightly less well prepared there. Russian forces, as they advance, I understand, are quite disciplined once they've cemented their control of building significant defences behind them to try and make it very, very difficult for Ukrainian forces to recapture that land. Final question for today, why are Moscow's airports still open? It's a fair question, but the answer is they have been shut repeatedly by Ukrainian drone strikes, less frequently, I think, in the last few weeks and months than we'd seen over the course of the last year. These are temporary closures. It's when Ukraine can get the drones in the sky and close to Moscow to threaten that airspace, but they have certainly done it. Thank you very much for watching Frontline. If you've got any questions, please ask them in the comments below, and I look forward to answering as many as I can next time.